Okay, I don't want to start too early because we are streaming, but if you guys give me the okay, then I'll go ahead and start. We're good. Okay, this is always a great moment when we get to have the OU logo imposed on O State TV. And so we are, of course, very, very grateful for our speaker today. I thank you all for coming. My name is Randy Kluver. I'm the Dean of the School of Global Studies and Partnerships at Oklahoma State University. And this event today is part of the ongoing programming of the Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies program at Oklahoma State. Our program was founded in 2015 with a generous donation from Mohammed and Jalal Farzaneh and the Farzaneh Family Foundation, who gave their gift to OSU to make sure that generations of OSU students have a better understanding of the issues and challenges facing Iran and Iran-U.S. relations. And so as part of our efforts this year, we wanted to invite a speaker, a friend from the University of Oklahoma, Dr. Saleh Tabrizy, who is joining us. Let me give just a little bit of context to his talk. All of you know that U.S. relations with Iran have been troubled for at least 4 decades, since the 1979 revolution that overthrew the Shah. Although there have been multiple attempts at improving ties, we remain at conflict over a number of important issues, including the status of Iran's nuclear program, its involvement in exporting Shia political and revolutionary groups and movements to other states, including Lebanon and Iraq, and by the devastating sanctions imposed on Iran by the U.S. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, often called the Iran nuclear deal, was agreed to by a number of nations in 2015, and it promised to lift some of these sanctions if Iran would suspend, in some ways, its nuclear program. Less than 3 years later, however, President Trump withdrew the United States from the agreement, arguing that it wasn't working. So now we're left with at an impasse, with both sides unable to find agreement on how we move forward. So to speak to this issue and the role of the new Iranian government, which just came into power this year, in the context of the global economy, we have invited Dr. Saleh Tabrizy, who currently is an associate professor in the Price College of Business at the University of Oklahoma. His research interests include international economics and the economics of development, innovation, and growth. So, Dr. Tabrizy, please welcome, and please join us up here.
Thank you, Dean. I appreciate it. Dean, I think you may need your phone. Perhaps.
I will. Thank you. And if I could ask you to turn off your phones, that would be great.
If you don't mind, I'm going to take off my mask. And for those of you who are watching this live or on recorded video, I am at a safe distance from the audience, which is why I took off my mask. So good to see you. Thank you so very much, Dean, for extending this invitation. And thank you to Dr. Fullerton for your kind invitation. This is an absolute pleasure for me to speak tonight regarding Iran's conservative administration and the global economy. I would like to thank those who supported the Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies program, Farzaneh's brother, for their support of this program and the scholarship that is done as part of this program. And I would also like to thank the School of Global Studies and Partnership here at Oklahoma State University and the amazing students who attended this meeting. The problem that I have is that I don't have a thing to shift this to the next slide. Who has that? Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. So, I will briefly talk to you about the history of conservatism versus reform in post-war Iran. I begin my talk with a description of those developments just to show you that the dichotomy between conservatism and reform is a real dichotomy when it comes to Iran politics. Then I will attend to the economic crises that Iran, and in particular the new conservative government that the Dean was talking about, is currently facing. And then, towards the end, I conclude by looking into the outlook within the short run and have some guess regarding what the incentives might be for the new conservative government. So that's the plan of the talk. There's a note, however. I am an economist by training. I'm interested in international economics, and I am by no means an expert in political sciences. So I won't be talking about the politics as a field of my expertise. I will just describe to you the history of the historic developments that happened after the Iran-Iraq war to show you that there is this dichotomy. That's my only purpose. I don't want to step outside of my area of expertise and pretend that I actually know something about the politics of the matter. I don't. Okay? Now, with that caveat in mind, I would like to, well, this is no more news. Dean gave it away. But I would like to let you know that conservatives are back again. And I hope that I can describe the history of conservatism versus reform in post-Iran-Iraq war Iran in a very free, descriptive sort of analysis. So, revolutionary Iran's history could be divided into two phases. One phase deals with the revolution and the war, starting from 1979, think of it as early 1979, that would be February, all the way to summer 1988. And then there is the post-Iran-Iraq war era. I'm just going to refer to it as post-war Iran, which starts from 1988 and goes onwards up to the minute. And the story of conservatism versus reform could be understood within the context of the latter time. And in order to describe this well, I am going to describe a few things about elections in Iran, and I think that through that you may get a sense of how the balance of power may change in a country like Iran. So, I'll begin with presidential elections. I'm pausing so you can go to the next. Yeah. Presidential elections are in no way compared in Iran with Western European countries. That's because of the presence of a body called Constitutional Council. Those of you who know Farsi, that's called Shorای نگهبان قانون اساسی. The best translation would be Constitutional Council. The Constitutional Council has some power over vetting candidates, which makes Iran's election system very different from the election system in Western Europe. I've got to give you that caveat first. But then I have to add that many leading Middle Eastern countries don't even have such opportunities. So those elections, despite their limitations, create some political and social space for Iranians. With that caveat, I would like to go and describe the presidential elections starting from 1989. Ever since then, we have had 9 elections. The first 2 elections led to 2 governments that you really can't say whether they are conservative or reformist, but the elements of conservatism versus reform is being built in during these 2 periods. I would say that the former government was slightly more reformist than the latter, but you really don't have a historical context there. Starting from 1997, you have this clear dichotomy between conservatism and reform in Iran. And ever since then, 4 governments were mostly within the reform campaign, and 3, including the one that started a few months ago, are considered to be conservative governments. Now, just to give you guys a sense of the political participation in these elections, it is worth noting that the median turnout for these elections are sitting at about 67%. For your reference, the United States presidential election during the same period had a turnout close to 58%. So 67% is comparable to the participation that is done in the United States. The median figure includes the low participation in the previous election in Iran and the high participation in the previous in the United States. So there's a little bit of balance there, right? But presidential election is not the only set of elections. You have also legislative and local councils elections. I can go into the details, but the bottom line is that there has been a balance between conservatism and reform when it comes to presidential elections in Iran. However, when it comes to legislative elections and when it comes to councils elections, it's mostly tilted towards conservatism. Okay? So, my goal was to describe this history and tell you that there is a balance between conservatism and reform. Now, this balance has given rise to some clear political cycles. And in particular, there are two cycles that I'm very interested in. One starts from 2005, ending in 2013. Another one started from this summer. These are the conservative political cycles in Iran. I anticipate that under a status quo, the latter cycle would last for at least 8 years. So, we are in for a ride. The conservative government is in, and they're going to be staying around for about 8 years. Now, they face an economic crisis. In particular, I argue that there are multiple crises, but one of them is the most important one that keeps policymakers worried and concerned. Here's the story. After the war with Iraq, Iran's economy started an expansion path. It went through that expansion for many years until the second half of the second conservative government, that would be starting from 2011. From there, they deviated away from the trajectory of extension. And that created a problem because they have been staying off of that trajectory for many years, almost a decade now. That, in my view, is the most important challenge that the conservative government faces. To that, you must add the fact that they have limited access to revenues from oil exports, which is going to amplify the budget deficit, which is already sitting at high levels. I'll show you a few figures. And that there is depreciations in nominal exchange rate. And these two together amplify inflationary pressures in Iran, and there appears to be some adverse effects on the labor market. But the chief challenge in between is the deviation from post-war expansion. Now, I had conversations with a few colleagues who are interested in international economics. I met an Iranian faculty. I met another Iranian faculty there. I had a conversation with one of the audience who introduced herself, and I know that she's also Iranian and she has some familiarities with Iran. Other than that, I believe most of you guys don't know much about Iran's economy. So let's get to know Iran's economy a bit. Think about the GDP. That's your gross domestic product. Imagine that you add up the value of all products and services that a country produces and offers throughout a year, and you put that into a measure of price that takes into account the purchasing power parity, such that the food, the Mexican food that you have in Mexico, they call it food over there, but anyways, the Mexican food that you have in Mexico, have that, keep that in mind. Many of you have been there. Keep that in mind, how delicious it was. Now, remember what the price was. Compare it to a price of a similar sort of product in Stillwater, or, I don't know, Edmond, or Oklahoma City, or Norman. You get the same product, but at much higher prices here. Now, we got to adjust for that. If you don't, then you are going to underestimate the output and the value added generated in developing countries, including Iran. So we correct for that purchasing power parity, and we measure the amount of gross domestic product. Think of it as the purchasing power parity of the value added of a given economy within a given year. Then take that GDP divided by the population, and you get to GDP per capita. Starting from 1990 all the way to 2020, Iran's GDP, PPP, standing for purchasing power parity, GDP PPP per capita is in an envelope between South Africa and Brazil. So if you've been to South Africa, if you've been to Brazil, if you have some ideas about those two countries, their economy in terms of value added per capita would be quite similar to Iran's economy. Now, Some of you may be more familiar with the area in which Iran is located. So in the next slide, I make a comparison between Iran and its peers. In particular, I'm bringing in Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. As you can see, Iran's GDP per capita has been sitting comfortably north of where Egypt's per capita figures are sitting, but they've been converging recently. I'll talk about that convergence a bit. Towards the beginning of this time series, Iran and Turkey were kind of close, but now they're diverging. And again, I will talk about the reasons behind that divergence. And as you can see, all of these sit way south of where Saudi Arabia's figures are sitting. That should give you an idea, huh? When it comes to Iran's economy, it should be something close to Egypt, a little bit south of where Turkey is located, and way south of where per capita figures for Saudi Arabia is located. Now, let me give you a few aggregate figures. In 2020, think about the world economy as a whole. The United States, in purchasing power parity measures, produced $20 trillion worth of value added. A trillion is a million, 10 raised to the power of 12. China produced slightly more than that, just a bit. European Union, almost the same, slightly less. So, $20 trillion, the United States, $20 trillion or so, China, $20 trillion or so, the European Union. Add them together, you get $60 trillion, right? That is half of global value added already. Meaning that the remaining half is produced by remaining countries. So out of $1 of value added in the world, 50 cents is produced by the United States, China, and the European Union. The remaining 50 cents is produced by the rest of the world. Right? Take that $20 trillion worth of value added in 2020 for the United States. Iran's value added in the same year is $1 trillion, meaning that out of $1 of value added generated in this economy in the United States, only 5 cents is generated in Iran's economy. That should give you the comparison between the size. So you're talking about a fairly small economy. And as you can see, for Egypt, almost the same, about $1.2 trillion. When it comes to Saudi Arabia, slightly more, $1.5 trillion. And when it comes to Turkey, Turkey is twice as large as Egypt, 2.4. That should give you a pretty good idea of how large these economies are. So, per dollar of value added generated in the United States, 5 cents is generated in Iran. I think at this point you should have a pretty good and rough idea about how large this economy is. Fairly small, but fairly important. All right? Now, my underlying thesis was that this economy has been suffering from one important challenge. There has been a long-lasting halt in its post-war expansion. And in order to bring this up, I am going to make use of the data that is put together by the the Angus Madison data project at the University of Groningen. And here I have a pretty good time series. I'm not making a comparison between different countries, so I'm sticking to real GDP per capita data rather than PPP stuff. Here is 1953. We start from 1953. That's when the United States and United Kingdom engaged in a coup against the democratically elected prime minister in Iran. You may have heard this story. After that, you have the second phase of Pahlavi's administration. Until 1976, you have a pretty impressive expansion in economic activities. Starting from 1976, you see a dramatic decline in economic activities, and that decline goes on until the end of Iran-Iraq war. And in between, you have the revolution in 1979. Then, starting from 1988, all the way to 2011, you see an upward trend, making up for the drop in GDP per capita resulting from what happened between 1976 and 1988. They make up for that, and they go even beyond that until 2011. As of 2011, they have been taken a hit, and they have not been able to recover. That, in my view, is the greatest challenge that they are facing right now. This data goes until 2018, so I brought in another data that goes all the way to 2020. In order to understand this data, imagine that Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt all produced $1 of value added in 2011, a decade ago, right? You can see that from that, they diverge. Turkey is producing about $1.50 now, after a decade. Egypt, pretty impressive actually. Saudi Arabia, not as impressive as Turkey and or Egypt. But Iran has been doing poorly compared to its peers. If they were producing $1 of value added per capita in 2011, today they are producing merely 80 cents. That challenge is what the conservative government is currently faced with. And remember, they are in and they want to govern for about 8 years. That's problematic. Now, going onward, I would like to bring in a study that was recently published in working paper capacity. So this is not yet peer-reviewed. This is by Hashem Pesaran, who is at University of Southern California and also at Cambridge, and one of his graduate students at Southern California. They look into the effect of sanctions on economic growth in Iran, and they say that sanctions have negatively affected economic growth in Iran, and if you want to quantify it, the cost is about 2% per year. What is the counterfactual? The counterfactual would be a growth close to Indonesia or South Korea. It would be about 5% per year. So they could have grown at 5% per year. Because of sanctions, they are growing at 3% per year. That 2% is the cost of sanctions. And if you ask me whether that is even important, I would give you this statistic. It would take 15 years for an economy to double in size if they are growing at 5%. Same economy would take 25 years to double in size if they are growing at 3%. So the cost of those sanctions is 1 decade of catching up. These are significant costs. And I argue that a good amount of this cost has been imposed on Iran ever since 2011. Now, those sanctions have limited Iran's ability to export oil. The next figure is coming from a working paper that my good colleague Firat Demir at University of Oklahoma and I have been working on. This is partly peer-reviewed, but we are working on the revisions currently to be published in Review of Development Economics. And as you can see, we have a measure for sanction intensity, in a sense, the cumulative count of sanctions. And the moment that this cumulative sanction starts to pick up after 2011, you see a significant drop in the amount of oil exports. Lodati and Pesaran look into this more closely, the next figure, and they actually look at it from 1979 all the way to 2020. They look into the news coverage of sanctions, and they show that when sanctions are more intensified, the quantity of oil exports decline. So we had only a limited window from 1995 all the way to 2014. They have a much broader window, and they can show that sanctions do affect the ability of Iran to export oil. Despite all the talk, it actually does affect Iran's ability to export oil. Now, if you go to the next one, this effect on oil exports has amplified Iran's budget deficit. Think about Iran's budget. You're going to have a bunch of costs, the expenditure side. Then on the revenue side, you're going to have revenues that are obtained through export of crude oil. Unlike the United States, where private entities do that, the central government possesses the oil resources. So the export revenues are actually, the proceedings actually go to the central government. And then there are the tax revenues and such. Now, when the economy takes a hit, the cost and the expenditure stuff are sticky. You can't really adjust them as well. But then your deficit takes a hit. And this is what you observe when you look into the deficit. So the bars, again, are showing the intensity of sanctions. And what you see in the connected dot lines are basically a measure of deficit as percentage of GDP. That measure is developed by Kosei and their colleagues at the World Bank, and the measure for sanctions and those, that comparison is coming from my ongoing work with Yashar Tarverdi. The thesis that we are showing here is that when sanctions are intensified, public budget deficit amplifies because of the channel through exports of oils. Now, in the next figure, I would like to show you the depreciation of rial, basically over the last, 8 years almost, give or take. This starts from early 2013 and goes all the way until a few weeks ago. And you can see that throughout this window, we have the area where we had JPOA and JCPOA. The dean was talking about them. Then we have President Trump not recertifying the JCPOA agreement, and then we have President Trump walking away from that agreement. Following that, rial took a hit and dropped in its nominal value. Sadly enough, the inflation was so high that even such depreciation didn't lead to greater competitiveness of prices. In fact, if you look into the annual figures, these are coming from the IMF. If you go to the next one, I can show you this. The Iran rial actually appreciates over the years. Despite the nominal depreciation, in real term, Iran rial appreciates. And that's the worst kind of nominal depreciation that you want. Because A, you're going to have the depreciation of national currency. You think that we're going to have greater competitive prices out there. But guess what? Because of inflation, that whole competitiveness is gone. And you get this cat-looking head. You see, those are the ears and such. That's the appreciation that happens there. Very sad. There are two reasons for it: the high inflation and also the rigidities that there are in the foreign exchange market. Now, because of two channels, one of them examined in Laudati and Pesaran's work the nominal exchange rate depreciation, and the other one examined more fully in my work with Yashar on amplified budget deficit and inflation. Because of these two channels, we believe that sanctions have amplified inflationary pressures in Iran as well. To show you this better, I want to show you a time series. All of those bars are again sanctions stuff, right? And the sanctions intensity measures are coming from Laudati and Pesaran. The CPI is coming from the central bank, and this is what Yashar and I are currently working on. Imagine that you have a basket which is worth 1 cent in 1979. A basket of goods and services. We call that the consumer basket. We take that consumer basket, we price it, and then we call it an index. We call it consumer price index. You may have heard in the news. The CPI, the United States has the same thing, right? That CPI is about 1 cent the day after the revolution. By 2018, the same basket is about $1.50. That is significant amounts of inflationary pressure. And if you actually take a look at the slope of the CPI figure, the connected data stuff, you can actually see that the inflationary pressure reacts to the pressure from the sanctions. Now, you can't really see it unless, Nikki, you go to the slope parameter, because the slope of CPI is basically the growth of those price measures. And you can see that I take the slope from, say, 2000 all the way to about 2010. Kind of tough to climb on, but when you compare it to what happens from 2011 onwards, it's almost impossible to climb on. That tells you that responding to sanctions, inflationary pressure has been building up in Iran. That was grammatically wrong. Has been building up in Iran. That is grammatically correct. Now, I'm going to skip these three. Now, all that those three wanted to show was that the effects on inflation is persistent. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to look at Laudati and Pessaran's work. But beyond inflation, there is an effect on the labor market. In particular, they show that if you take the peers of Iran in MENA being Middle East and North Africa, take those peers. Because of sanctions, employment in Iran has been contracting at about 1% more than a typical contraction in MENA countries. Right? And if you go back one, and Javad Nusratabadi, who is at University of Pittsburgh now, he also has a paper that shows that not only we can observe this in aggregate level, but we can also observe this at industry level, meaning that those sanctions have had employment effects in Iran, not only in aggregate, but also in industry level, in particular the industries that are less productive. Okay? Now, another thing that Laudati and Pessaran show is that sanctions have an adverse effect on female labor force participation. In a sense, female labor supply has been affected negatively from sanctions, they argue. And they have some evidence to suggest. Like, these are statistical work, these are applied statistics work, right? So their evidence suggests that female labor force participation in Iran has been affected negatively. With Firat Demir, we've been working on a paper that looks at industry level rather than aggregate figure, and we're looking at the equilibrium employment. And our evidence also suggests, we're not talking about labor supply, now we're actually talking about employment. Our evidence also suggests that through sanctions, when you control for a whole lot of other things, through sanctions, growth of female employment in manufacturing industry in Iran has slowed down compared to male employment in manufacturing. Now, what has happened in the services industry? That's a very interesting question. At this point, I have no answer to provide. But what we see in the manufacturing industry is that capital-intensive industries and those industries that rely heavily on imported inputs, the female employment has gone down dramatically. These suggest that there might be some gendered employment effect from sanctions that are now being explored. These studies that I brought to you are fairly recent, and because we are about a decade into this intense sanction pressure. So most of these are not yet peer-reviewed. But I just wanted to give you guys the most recent findings that we have in the literature. With that, I'll go after the outlook. So, under the status quo, as I mentioned, we expect the conservative government to govern for at least 8 years. They cannot govern unless they sort out their economic problems, in particular when it comes to sanctions. I didn't say a single thing about COVID. COVID hit Iran's economy very hard, and its society. I didn't say a single thing, because that's not my line of research, so I've been sticking to my line of research. COVID has amplified the situation a bit. But sanctions alone have kept Iran's economy away from growth. They cannot go on unless they sort out this problem. They've been given enough room to maneuver in foreign policy. They've been given an opportunity to appoint those that they want in key positions in the government. Unfortunately, when it comes to the economics team, oh boy, there's no coherent agenda there. It's a choice of random conservatives there. So I'm very hopeless there. But they had the opportunity to appoint the key persons. Now, all of these would make me think, what would they do? First, they keep their moves away from the West and towards China. This is a move that they have already started, and I think they are going to do this even further. I've been talking to John earlier today, and I told him that I'm going to bring a few things from trade here. I want to show you the export destination composition for Iran back in 2000. You see those purple countries? Those are European destinations. right? The red ones are Asian destinations, except for Iraq. So Iraq is not here because Iraq in 2000 was a different country compared to the one that I want to compare to. I'll talk about Iraq later. But those purple countries are European destinations. You see that there is a balance. Most of the trade is with Asian destinations, some with European, and then you've got the rest. The next shows the combination in 2019. There is a significant shrinkage in the share of European destinations in Iran exports. That's the tilt towards east, away from the west. And I do believe that they are going to continue doing that. Now, is it bad? I'll reflect upon that after I talk about Iraq. But I want you guys to make a comparison between these two, which shows you that Iran has moved away from continuing its trade relationship with the West and moving towards China. And you may say that, oh, China is a different country throughout these 2 decades. Absolutely. But go to its peers, to Iran's peers, pick up Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, you don't see such change. In fact, there are a few papers on the tilt away from Western countries towards Eastern markets. And I think that's very important, and they're going to continue that. If it was a few months ago, I would have had Afghanistan next to Iraq here, because over the last few years, Iran has been developing greater trade ties with Afghanistan. Due to the unfortunate events over the last few weeks, I took off Afghanistan from there because I'm looking into the outlook. I do believe that Iran is going to engage more and more in trade with Iraq, in particular because of the nature of industries and firms that are going to take on exporting activities. To give you a comparison, back in 2000, Iran exported about $100 million to Iraq. The data is coming from the UN Comtrade. In 2019, that amount was actually lower than 2018 figures, but that amount was sitting at about $6.5 billion. So they have a market there. In a paper that was published in Comparative Economic Studies, Ali Pay and I show that close to 20% of Iran's non-oil exports are actually destined for Iraq today, right? Is it bad? No. Think about the United States. Gravity rules, huh? The United States trades with its neighbors, Canada, Mexico. It also trades with great mass out there. European Union, China. That's how gravity works, right? When it comes to Iran, gravity still rules. Iran will be trading a lot with its neighbors. And it's also trading with China, which is a great mass. The problem is that there is this other great mass of economic activities, the European Union, that Iran is moving away from. That is bad news. Because as a nation, you want to have a well-diversified set of export destinations. So if one takes a hit, you can diversify away from it. You want to keep your export markets active and dynamic, and Iran is going to a corner. On the neighbor side, they have lost Afghanistan, probably, I don't know, probably. They have Iraq, some trade ties, that's going to continue. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, they're there, some relationship there. And then they have China. But what about all of those Western European countries that used to be export destinations 2 decades ago? Right? That is the consequence of sanctions, something that is often neglected unless you start looking into the actual trade data. Now, when it comes to macroeconomic outlook, I think that they are going to need those oil exports revenue, otherwise their fiscal space is going to be very narrow. They're also going to need access to the financial system in the world, otherwise they cannot carry on with their transactions and or transfers. And all of these, in my view, would give them enough incentives to actually engage with the US, with the European Union and such. Unlike those who believe that the conservatives in Iran are less likely to engage with the United States the European Union, I actually argue that they are more likely to engage. Trita Parsi and Kim Ghattas have published 2 books. I encourage you guys to read them if you are interested in learning more about the Middle East. They tell us a story, something that has happened in 2012. Iran and the United States, away from the European Union and other nations who had been involved in dealing with Iran, in 2012 go to Oman and they meet secretly. For a while, that remains a big secret. What the Dean was talking about the JPOA and the JCPOA was actually a consequence of that talk in Oman. Who knows? I have no information, but they may actually be talking now as we speak. And I do believe that since that was a fully conservative initiative, I do believe that they may have room to engage with the United States and with the European Union. Otherwise, they're going to have problems to govern throughout the 8 years. They don't want to govern a bankrupt nation. No, they have political interests. And I do believe that they're going to be in big trouble if they don't materialize such relationships. Now, as for the short-run outlook, this is going to be my concluding remarks. As for the short-run outlook, the IMF predicts that the growth is going to be sitting at about 2, maybe 2.5, with a stretch sitting at about 3% or so. But the more conservative estimation is about 2% by the end of 2022. That would be 2021 and 2022. And if that happens, just to give you guys an idea, by the end of 2022, Iran's economy is going to be where it was by the end of 2018, way south of where it was back in 2017. It's a dim outlook, not so bright. And to make up for all of these fluctuations and to try to go back to the post-war expansions, they really need to grow faster. For that, they really need to sort out the problems with sanctions. For that, they really need to engage with the United States and the European Union. And if there is one body that could do this thing directly, that would be the conservative body in Iran. Now, that, in my view, as a voter, may not necessarily be the greatest news, but in the reality of politics in Iran, that is a channel that provides incentives for them to engage with the United States. If they don't, they're going to have troubles in growth, they're going to have inflationary pressures, and they're going to have a mess of labor market. My hope is that they engage in a productive manner with the West, and they can sort this out and get back even closer and closer and closer to the post-war expansions. But we have to wait and see. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tabrizy. We're going to have a question and answer period now, and I do have the mic this time. I forgot to use it earlier. But please wait to ask your question until you have the mic so we can pick it up on video. And while we're waiting on that, I'd just like to ask you one question. What is the likelihood, you've posited this conflict between ideology, as it were, and the pragmatic needs. What do you think is the likelihood that the current government will approach and try to re-engage the West? And then I'm going to turn this over to Nikki. So if you have a question, raise your hand and Nikki will bring that to you.
Thank you, Dean. This is actually a good question. So as an applied person, I actually have to put on a figure on it. I would say that the chances are more than flipping a coin. So after all, they have 8 years to govern. And there are some important transitions that may happen within these 8 years. Remember that part of Iran governance is non-elected. And that part may need to retire. That requires a smooth transition from the non-elective body now to the non-elective body after. That would require them some peace, some security. And that peace and security may be obtained to some degree if they engage actively with the West. Now, they may not get the best deal because Well, they may not know how to deal with that, right? The previous team has been engaged with the West for a while. They have the know-how. That team is gone. The new team has to learn. And the experience of what happened from 2011 all the way to 2013 at government level shows that they are very naive in dealing with Western countries. So they may not get the best deal, but I think they gotta be keen to engage with the United States and Europe. Otherwise, I wonder, how do they want to govern? Can they really carry on with this for 8 years? I highly doubt it. So because of that, I would say that the chances are greater than 50%, but going beyond that would be a stretch for me. I hope I managed to add this to consent.
Can I go? Hi. So my question was, you mentioned the dangers and concerns that you had if Iran continues to go down the path of trading with the East and specifically China. Would those concerns worsen if U.S.-Chinese relations were to go south as well? Would that intensify the economic dangers for Iran?
Well, that is actually a very good question. So let me share my thoughts in the following manner. The concern that I have for Iran would be the concern of a policymaker for a given country. Imagine that I've been invited to DC to give advice on trade relationship. One thing that I would say to a congressman, to someone in executive body, is to keep your export destinations in a diverse set. Don't walk away from trade destinations that have been built in after years of work, right? Don't do that. Now, what Iran has done is that it has easily lost the trade destinations that were in Western Europe. Now, that's problematic. But what would happen to Iran if the relationship between the United States and China goes sour? I don't think there is going to be any significant positive spillover for Iran, because Iran's economic activity will be determined regardless of what goes on between the United States and China. I don't see any positive spillovers there. As for negative spillovers, I can't see anything either. So ultimately, I would say whatever goes on between them, Iran is still going to pay the price of being isolated within the world economy. But ultimately, that challenge, that whole tension between the two can have consequences for the world economy. And through that, Iran may suffer, or any other country in the region may suffer, right? Keep in mind that these are commodity exporters. So any sort of cooling down of demand and or productive activities in the world would affect them. Think of it through the equilibrium prices of crude oil, for example. That would lower their fiscal capacity. So in that sense, there might be some, but that is not Iran specific. That is region and commodity exporter specific, in my view. Very good question, Lo.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk. It was really interesting to me to see the coming back after the war and how fast the economy was growing. So my question is, if everything goes well and during these 8 years they have negotiations and the sanctions are lifted fully or partially, how fast and to what extent do you think they can come back? Because I've been hearing about losing some of the markets, especially with crude oil, that it requires different types of refineries can process different types of crude oil. So if you lose that market, it's not easy to go back there. And then with the whole movement to green economy and investment in solar and wind, if they still are hoping that they could, 4 or 5 years come back and have oil exports, how realistic is that?
Mm-hmm. This is a good question. So, I do agree with you. They have been facing problems because they have been isolated. So the moment that you are isolated and don't engage in trade as you want to, because of, say, sanctions and such, you're not going to be upgrading your technology. You're not going to be looking into new niches in the market. You're going to be a passive commodity exporter whenever you get a chance. You export it to Syria, you export it to Venezuela. That's not going to change your technology. So that I agree with. But to give you a sense of the amount of catch-up, imagine that they produce $1 of value added now. That's going to translate in aggregate figure to $1 trillion in 2020. They're going to need another 20 cents, 25 cents and such to get close and close to that post-war expansion. And in my view, they have a 2 stages game. The first stage is to add that 20%, get back to the trend. Remember, we were getting back and getting closer to the trend after the JCPOA. We were actually going back. If you look closely, you're going to see that there is this bounce back. But then it goes south when President Trump walks out, right? So they can go back there. That's the first stage of that game. I think that sanction reliefs, greater integration with the world economy would allow for that, right? But then, in order to stay on that trajectory or go north of that, like what Turkey did, for example, they're going to need what you mentioned. They're going to need to upgrade their technology. They're going to need to integrate greater and greater with the world economy and bring in more foreign direct investment and engage in exporting activities through those foreign direct investments, right? And I don't know how far they're going to get to. My concern so far is with the first stage. And I argue that they really need to play this first stage well. What happens after that, I can't really say much. But I do agree with you that the second stage would require upgrading technology, finding new export products, products for exports, and finding new niches in the market. I do agree with you. But that is of second stage. Not that, it doesn't mean that it's of secondary importance, no. In order to stay on that trajectory, you actually have to continue with upgrading your technology and such. And that would get Iran back to a growth of about 5% or so per year. That second stage is way ahead of us. I really can't wrap my head around it. But I agree with the concerns that you have. Great question.
Sorry. To give those of us that know less about Iran a little bit more context, could you speak in broad terms the differences in policy goals between the conservatives and the reformists and the economic policy tools they tend to leverage to achieve those goals?
John, this is an excellent question. So, historically, the conservative administration in Iran was not trusting the United States, and with an extension, was not trusting and putting its trust in Europe. That I can say. Now, as for the economic policy tools that they have, I think all of those will be defined within the framework of bureaucracy in Iran. The major difference would be to bring in foreign direct investment and make Iran a country that is engaged more and more in global production activities and innovation activities. That would be something that perhaps a reformist candidate can go for and opt for. Whereas a conservative would say no to those foreign direct investments. We don't know. Those are Americans. Those are Western firms. Those are even South Korean firms that are under the influence of American policymakers. They're going to say no to those, and they're going to go after stuff that are mostly made up. Like, we're going to have this great foreign direct investment coming from other Islamic countries, for example. Yeah, you could, but you're not really in any good relationship with either. So I would say that in general, those policy tools that require greater participation in global economy are more likely to be among the tools that reformists are talking about. Whereas those that are more that require more isolation on Iran's part are on the list that conservatives talk about. That's why they really like to engage in trade with countries like Iraq, prior to this, like Afghanistan, because they're confident with the type of trade that they engage in. They really don't want to engage in trade where they don't really have a whole lot of trust. Historically, they have, this is very odd, and we can chat about the reasons. I have some hypotheses about the reason, but I don't really know. But historically, they trust the East, in particular China, more than the West, in particular Europe. Because the story of foreign relationship for Iran is not the story of East China versus West, which is the United States really doesn't matter much. What matters is Western Europe. The US is a remote country compared to Iran, or you can say that Iran is a remote country compared to the US, but Western Europe is right there, right? And they have been more trusting China for some odd reasons ever since 1988, and they don't really trust Western Europe as much, or the United States as much. Why that's the case, I have some hypotheses, we can talk about it, but I don't really know. Great question.
So you just said that Iran have been, trusting China. So a few months ago, during President Rouhani's, Iran signed like a big deal with China, in which China will invest about $400 billion in the Iran's economy. So how beneficial do you think, or unbeneficial, this will be for Iran's economy in the long term?
Mm-hmm. Iran is not the first recipient of foreign direct investment from China. Many African countries have received such, and there are horror stories of the consequence of such investments. So potentially those investments could provide nothing beyond the politics of the matter, and could even indebt Iran to China, which is not a good idea. That being said, just like trade, when you need diverse destinations, when it comes to foreign direct investment, you need diversified origins. So you don't want to rely only on Western Europe, for example, to invest in your economy. No, you also want Japanese firms. You also want Chinese firms. So in that sense, that might generate an opportunity. I have to tell you one thing, though. I have not seen the agreement, and I don't actually know if the details of agreements are out. So I really cannot speak about the details of that deal, but it's good to have that opportunity. Iran should be very wise on making choices that are going to help Iran's economy to export more, diversify its exports away from oil exports and export more of non-oil products and such, to more diversified destinations and such, right? That's a good thing, but it's not enough. You don't want to be a country that only goes to China and asks for funds for investments. You want to be a country that has China on the roster, has Western Europe on the roster, has the oil-rich countries on the roster. That would be a diversified set of countries for the origins. That, I would argue, is much better, right? That being said, this agreement is actually quite interesting, and I myself am awaiting to see the details. To the best of my knowledge, no details are out off of that agreement. So I don't really know what the actual consequences for, say, manufacturing or services sectors are in Iran, or agriculture, by the way, because they are engaged in some fishing. Some of my good friends who are engaged in agricultural research here at OSU, they know more. So they are also engaged in that sector. But those details are not yet available, at least to me. I don't know about that. Great question.
Thank you very much.
Oh,
Professor
thank you.
Tabrizy. Thank you all for being here today. If you would join me in thanking our speaker one last time.
Thank you so very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
And you've brought to light the very interesting relationship between the sanctions and Iran's economic growth, and the politics and the economics of this very troubled region. Thank you again.
Thank you so very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you all for being here.